Alright, hello everyone. We're back, and in this video we're going to cover how to basically create our own sort of mini command prompt in Python. We're going to specifically just look at supporting these three commands related to listing the contents of a directory and navigating the file system, and depending on how things go we might add a few more, but that's what we'll start out with. So to start, I'm going to open up idle, our little Python shell here, and I'm going to create a new file to hold our program. I'm going to go ahead and hit Control S to save it, and we'll just go save it in this temp2 folder and call it Python command prompt.py. Alright. If we go back to our initial command prompt here, you'll see that at the very most basic thing it needs to do is basically print out our current location, our current path, and then also prompt us in waiting for the user to enter some text, which might be a bad command, but anyway, so let's start with having the prompting portion kind of happen here. So if you recall from some previous exercises, there is this input function that we can use to get user input, and it takes a little prompt here, so, and then returns what the user typed in. So that's what we're going to start with. Let's go back here. So let's just say our user input, that variable, is going to be equal to the input that we get from the user, and I'm just going to put it to do put current path here. And then we'll also want to have a little right arrow there. So that's our program so far. Let's run it and see what happens. So you see here we have this to-do being printed out, and then we can type in whatever, and then once we're done, our program kind of ends and returns. So that's fine. The next thing we need to do is actually figure out how to get the current path, which is something that's often known as the current working directory. And let's see if this quickly shows it. Right, it's not showing up there, but I believe I know where this is from my familiarity with some of the documentation. So if I go here, let's look for the OS module here. So the OS module is built into the Python sort of its standard library, and it's a way to interact with the operating system a lot. And I believe there's a place to get the current working directory. So we'll just kind of scroll down here some. Hey, os.getcwd, I think that's it, standing for get current working directory. I'm just going to click this link here to see what's going on here. Alright, os.get current working directory is how we get a string for the current directory, so let's try that. If we go back to our program, Now, in order to use a module in the Python standard library, at least as long as it's not something that's like one of the built-in functions like input, we have to import that module to use. So I'm going to do that there, import OS. Then we're going to call os.get current working directory. And then I'm going to store that in a variable current directory path. And then what I want to say is our prompt for command is going to be the current directory path, and then we're going to add on this little arrow for prompting there. And then once we get that, we should basically just be able to put that in there in our input function, and let's run it and see what happens. Yep. So now you can see we're right in ctemp2, just kind of like our regular command prompt here. So if I type in something, our program will end because we haven't done anything else yet. Alright, back to our code. So we do kind of want our command prompt to basically run continuously unless a user explicitly chooses to exit. We don't want it to immediately exit after they type in something. So what I'm going to do that is we're going to need a while loop here. I'm just going to say while true, and that will basically keep our program running forever, indefinitely, until we basically have the user kill it or implement some way for the user to stop it based on what they type in. And if you recall from our discussions about while and if statements before, it's very important that you have all of the things you want to be part of the while loop that you want to repeat indented over. So now that we've done that, let's test our program. So I can type in whatever, and it's just continuing to run. Let's see if there's a way to specifically stop it. Okay, I don't see a way to stop it right now. It'll be forcefully restarted when we run our program again. But actually, let's go ahead and implement a way to stop it. And the way that works in a regular command prompt is you can just type exit, and it goes away. So let's do that for our program. So what we can say is if, I'm going to change these to double quotes. If exit is equal to what the user input, then we want to exit. Now, how do we exit a program kind of in Python? Well, we could actually sort of break out in our while loop with a break statement, which would break out of this loop and basically go down here to the end of our program, and then it would end. But to be a little more explicit, I want to use this function in the sys module, which is called exit. And this is sort of a way to exit our program. I think we've used that before. So if I go back to our program here, I'm going to need to import this module. And then down here, I just need to call sys.exit. And now, if I run our program again, if I type exit, then it should exit. And there we go. So that's good. All right. So what is the next thing we want to do? The dir command here. So that lists the contents of a directory, and I can actually search for that. Command prompt dir command. And let's see here. Here, this is like the official Microsoft documentation on the dir command. It displays a list of the directories, files, and subdirectories, and so there are all sorts of options here. We're just going to implement the most basic one, which lists just what's in our current working directory. So actually, let's bring this up, go back to our temp2 directory, and let's run that there. And so you see this is sort of what we get as output here. So how do we list well, let's start typing stuff in our program. So let's see, another command we're going to support is going to be dir. So if that is user input, what the user entered, how do we list the contents of a directory? So I believe this is also in the OS module. Let's see here. Yes, there is this OS list dir function, which does basically exactly what we want. It returns a list containing the names of the entries in the directory given by path. And it talks about more things here if you want to read more about it. So let's try using that function and see what we get. So let's say these are our directory entries, if you remember from our presentation last time, os.list_dir, and we're going to want to pass our current directory path. And then once we get that, we're going to want to print that out, our directory entries. So let's try running that program now and see what happens. So if I type dir, okay, so you see it's listing out the contents of our directory here, which appears to basically be the same here. We're not going to worry about the dots being excluded now. And we're also not going to quite get into specifically formatting what this output looks like, at least not quite yet. That involves Python lists, and well, you know what? Let's actually just go ahead and do that. So what I want to have happen is rather than listing things all on one line or potentially wrapping things around, I want to print each of these file names on their own separate line, sort of similar to this. We're not going to do things quite the same. But let's see what we might have to do here to make it look similar. To start, let's go ahead and mimic this like directory of ctemp2 output. So what we want to do is kind of print out a message that says what directory we're currently in. So let's just say current directory message is going to be, I'm going to add a space here because you'll notice there's a little space right before that. And then we're going to do directory of, and then we're just going to append our current directory path to this message here, and then we just want to print that out. And then after that, we're going to print our different directory entries, and we're not going to go with all of this fancy formatting quite yet for our particular program, but we'll want to do something similar where we print each one on each line. So what this list_dir function is doing is returning a list in Python. And to sort of show you what that looks like, we can create our own lists, which are just sort of collections of multiple things. So we could have our own different variables in Python. First item, and 2, second item, item 3, third item. But that's a lot of different variables to individually manage, and sometimes we might want a different varying number of things. Like maybe sometimes we want, all the way up to item 100, other times we don't. So Python supports a list, which sort of let us store multiple values within a single variable, as opposed to just a single variable. So if I do example list, can create a variable here. I'm going to assign it to a list value, and a list is essentially just you start a list with these square brackets, and then you close it with these end brackets. And then if you were to go and just sort of print out a list here, let's run this. If I type the dir command to trigger that logic, you might see that this here, let me make sure you guys can see it and my head's not in the way. Yeah, you'll see here it's basically just printing out those brackets to indicate that that's a list. But hey, the good news is that we have this directory of ctemp2 printing out basically correctly now, so that's good. Alright, so you can iterate through items in a list. Well, actually first, let's do this. If I have B, if I put those different items in my list now and then run the program, then I can do that, and you'll see it prints out exactly what's in my list here. Now to iterate through a list, to visit each individual item, we can use a for loop and say, hey, for each list item in my example list, I want to do something with it. Maybe I want to, add some text to it. That's something we can do. We can do whatever, just like a normal for loop. Here, we're just going to print out the list item. And so let's try running that. Type in our dir command, and you can see now it's printing that on each individual line. So that's good. So this basically works now. But now let's do that on our real list of directory entries, as opposed to that sample list. And we'll give this a better name, directory entry. And so let's now try running our program. Type in the dir command, and hey, now it's basically doing the same thing now. Doesn't quite have identical formatting, but that's sufficient for what we're going to try and attempt now. If you are curious, it looks like there's this scandir function. That might be a way to get more detailed information, but we're not going to quite tackle that yet. Alright, so that's the dir function. What else is there? Make dir. Okay, so we go to our Microsoft documentation. Oh, you'll see that this is the same as the md command. So we can go there, and all it does is create a directory or subdirectory. And then it basically takes a path here. So let's see what happens when we try to implement that. So we're just going to add another branch in our chain of this if-elif statement. So we'll just do make dir equals user input. Now before we implement this, I just want to show you some things that we're going to have to handle here. In make-dir branch. That's just some debug printing I'm going to print here, which will indicate us if we hit this branch or not. And for debugging purposes, I'm going to print out what our user input is here. Alright, so let's run our program and see what happens. So if I type just make-dir like this, you'll see our input is make-dir, and then it says we're in our make-dir branch. So that's fine. But we didn't actually specify a path, so this command isn't quite correct. If we said, hey, I want to make a subdirectory, and then pass that there, you'll see our entire user input, this first thing that gets printed out from this line right here, is basically the entire line of what our user implemented. So we need a way to handle sort of these space separated values here. So how can we do that? Because you'll notice that we didn't hit this make-dir branch because that's not what our user input was. Well, let's see here. There is a method that you can call on strings. It's built in. It's called split. And it basically splits a string based on white space by default, I believe. Yes, if the separator parameter is not specified or is none, runs of consecutive white space are regarded as a single separator, and basically it just removes them. So what that means is if we go back here to our program, we can basically split our user input into command and the arguments or parameters for our command by just calling user input dot split. And to show you what that looks like, I'm just going to print that out here. And then if we run our module and type make-dir subdirectory, you'll see now it splits it into those two different components here. Alright. So, let's start updating our code to handle the case where we have arguments for a particular command. What I'm going to do is we have our command and arguments here, and sort of by convention for our simple command prompt, and I think this is the case in just about everything, the actual command is just the first item. So we'll say our command is just going to be command and arguments, which is a list, and we're going to get element 0 out of it, which is the first thing, because typically lists and arrays and things like that in computers start counting at 0 instead of 1. And so now for correct handling of our command, we're going to need to fix this so that we're not checking like user input all the time, but instead we're checking command. And then now, if I run our program, and if I were to do, say, make-dir subdirectory, we should hit the make-dir branch now. So that's good. And let me test the other commands. Dir still seems to work, and then exit seems to work too. So that's fine. Alright, so how do we make a directory in Python? Well, I think that is also available via the OS module. So we go back to that. there is this makedir function, and we can provide a path there. It accepts a number of other arguments that we're not going to worry about right now, so we just need to specify the path. So let's do that. So what we're going to say is path of the directory to create is going to be, by convention, the next thing in our list of arguments. So after 0, which is our command, we want to go to item 1, which should be the path. And then from there, we just need to call os.makedir path of directory to create. And in theory, that should work fine. So if I do dir here, you see we only have myprogram.py and Python command prompt.py. Now if I do makedir and do subdirectory, that should have created the directory in theory. Let's run our dir command to see again. Hey, you see our subdirectory is listed there. And just to show you that that actually took effect, if we run our dir command in our actual command prompt, let me move that so you can see it. I'll run that again. Hey, you see subdirectory is now printed there too. And if we go back to our GUI here, you can see, hey, subdirectory exists. So there you go. And we can create more directories if we want. Makedir 2, makedir subdirectory 3. And you can see again, it's all being actually reflected on our actual computer, on its actual file system. Alright, so that is these first two commands here. Let's go ahead and add the cd command for changing directories. That's another good one we'll add. So to do that, we just need to check if cd is the command that our user entered. And if you actually go to the documentation for cd, let's see. I mean, you'll see it basically takes a path here. And so that's basically what we'll do. There are some other subtleties here, particularly on Windows, that we won't worry about. But essentially, we just need a path. So it's going to be very similar to our makedir command. So we just need the path of the directory to change to, which again, if someone types in, you know, cd, you know, subdirectory, that's going to be the first argument there. So we can do command and argument sub1. And then how do we actually change the directory? I think this is also somewhere in the OS module. Let's see. os.changedir. So that's simple enough here. So we just need to add that call. Changedir to path of directory to change to. And now let's run our program and see what happens. We cd to subdirectory. Hey, it's listing exactly what we had there. And if we print what's in there, you see there's nothing kind of listed in that subdirectory. Now let's see if we can actually change. Yep, we can sort of cd to dot, which is staying the same as in the current directory. And we can even go back up. So Python was very nice in that it kind of handled all of that for us. Let's see if there's anything else I want to try and implement now. Let's just look through the OS module and see if there's anything that seems interesting that we could implement. So we might be able to implement an open function here. I'll think about that. All right. Let's look at some of these things. OS.path is another module that's useful for a lot of path manipulation things. We don't necessarily need it for exactly what we're doing, but could be interesting for future things. So that's there. Nothing I see in there. So this command module is an interesting thing. Like if you wanted to basically use that to implement all of this stuff, you could essentially do it. It's a little more complicated if you're not used to programming, and probably more complicated than is needed for this, but it's another option. Alright, so I think the last thing we're going to do is let's have a way to basically implement the type command. So in our previous video, we saw how the type command basically sort of types out the contents of a text file. So if we go back to our command prompt here, and then if I did type of my program.py and prints that out, and we could even do that on our larger, huge program, and you should see that it's basically the same as what we have typed into the Python idle editor here. So this is the last thing we're going to do, and so let's sort of get started on that. So this is just going to be another branch here, type equals command, and then the path of file to print is going to just be our first argument there. And then how do we actually read in the contents of the file and then write them back out? Because this is just a file path, it's just going to be a string that looks like, you know, Python command prompt.py. Well, here in sort of the Python official documentation, you can kind of see it gives some info on how we can read and write files. We're not going to handle writing today, though if you want to look at how you could essentially write a new file, that's something you can explore. But the first thing we're going to do is call the open function, which is built into Python. So we're going to say that our file is going to be equal to open the path of the file to print. There is this thing talking about a file open mode here, which can be R for reading, W for writing. It's optional and defaults to R for reading, which is what we want to do. So I'm just going to not even worry about that for now. So there's this whole section here about files being in text mode versus binary mode. That's important for real serious programming. It's not too important for our initial program right now. So the important thing with using files is that once you open them, you have to actually close them in order to like release resources on your computer. And Python can do that automatically for you, even in the case of like errors, if you use the with statement when you're working with your file object. So we're going to do that here, and so we're going to change our syntax a little bit. Let me make sure you can read that. I'm going to say with open, and we're going to store the return value of that in a variable that we're calling file. And then from there we can essentially get the data we want out of it. So I'm just going to say, hey, they have an example right here on the Python website, so let's try that and see if that works. File contents, the contents of the file we want to print. We'll just do file.read and see if that gives us what we want. I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head. And then so let's print that out here. So we do run. I'll move this over to the other screen. Let's list what's in the current directory. Let's type out myprogram.py. If you look down here, it looks like it did print out hello, so that's successful. Let's also type out our Python command prompt.py, and you can see, hey, that's basically our same program that we have over here, so that's kind of neat. Now that did seem to work with this read function, but I just want to sort of look at the documentation here, the official documentation from Python, to see what else is there to make sure that is correct. Yeah, so it looks like from reading this description here, it'll basically read the entire file, and it's actually preserving new lines, which is how you saw that, you know, this had text printed on multiple lines here. So that's good. That's what we wanted. If you do actually want to read individual lines, you can call this readLine function, and you can actually use a for loop to go over the line as well. So those are other options Yeah. And if you do want to write a file, there's this write function you can call on a file too. Last thing, I think that's it for all the fancy functions we're going to do for our program. But you'll notice, like if I type in some bogus command that's not supported here, well, I had a comma there. It'll say, hey, this is not recognized as an internal or external command, operable program, or batch file. So we'll do something very similar. Now, since our command prompt here isn't going to support executing programs or batch files, which we're not going to get into here, we're going to tweak the error message a little bit and just say, hey, print, actually, let's see, unknown command message is going to be I want to have it surrounded by single quotes here, and then I want to do command surround it by single quotes again, is not recognized as an internal or external command. That's what our error message is going to look like. I'll bring that over here so you can hopefully see more of it. It's kind of long. So there it is, and then we just kind of need to print that out. And so assuming I didn't make any syntax errors there, we'll run our sample command prompt here and then type in some bogus command here and says, hey, it's not recognized as an internal or external command, so that's good. So to recap, we implemented that error handling, and there's a lot of error handling stuff you could implement here to make this program much more robust. It's not a little too advanced for what we're going to try to attempt today, but going back here, so we implemented the dir command, which lists the contents of the directory. We implemented the make dir command, which will let us create a new subdirectory, or a new directory where we are, and you can see that shows up here. We implemented the cd command, so we can change to directories, including going back up. We also implemented the type command, ta-da, and then finally the exit command, which let us exit our program. And that's all of this code here. So this will be added to the GitHub repository shortly, and then there will be a link on the web page here to this video and this actual code, so you can take a look at it later. But definitely, feel free to explore. Try creating your own custom commands. Like one thing we didn't do was how to create a new file, because that's a little more complicated, but you can see if you can figure that out. Anyway, so that's all for this video. Hope you all keep on learning and programming. Bye.